미국 증시에서 주요 지수들이 높은 인플레이션과 경기 침체에 대한 우려로 변동성이 심화하는 가운데 최근 주목할 만한 굵직한 이슈들이 있었죠. 머스크의 트위터 인수, 또 미국 증시에 상장된 중국 테크 기업들에 대한 규제, 루나 사태로 촉발된 가상화폐 폭락까지. 전부 미국의 규제 당국인 증권거래위원회 SEC에서 검토 중인 사안들인데요. SEC의 움직임은 기업의 실적은 물론 증시 전반에도 영향을 미치는 만큼 움직임에 주목하시는 투자자분들 굉장히 많으실 겁니다. 그래서 저희는 전 SEC 위원장이었던 하비 피트를 직접 만나서 시장 전반에 대한 분석과 함께 향후 전망을 들어봤습니다. Hello, this is Gio Lee. Welcome back to Talks with the Global Group today. Today we have Harvey Pitt. He's now Kalorama Partners CEO and former SEC chairperson. Mr. Pitt, great to see you.
It's good to see you.
You observed in several interviews that the board would conclude that Musk's offer to acquire Twitter was not in the interest of shareholders. Nevertheless, Musk mobilized the enormous funds and succeed in the acquisition. How do you expect Twitter's share price and shareholder profit?
Well, I think that Mr. Musk has clearly developed the financing. It seems he's got a number of sources now and has more than enough capital to make the acquisition. After initially opposing it, the board succumbed. I think they realized that the values that Twitter was hoping for would not be realized, and that Musk's bid was more than generous. There are still a lot of issues with respect to the acquisition. For one thing, the SEC is apparently investigating Mr. Musk because he filed the wrong forms and didn't alert investors that he was an aggressive investor looking to take over control of the company. I don't think that will ultimately hold up the transaction, but it is definitely an issue that will need to be resolved.
Related with the first question, Musk has announced plan to go public again within 2 years of delisting Twitter. It is interpreted that it is for the private equity funds that funded the acquisition process. Could Musk's plan be a problem?
I think Musk will eventually try to take Twitter public again. He's going to take it private now, make all the changes he wants to, install the people he wants running the company. But at that point, I think he's going to try to capitalize on the investment, and that means he will be taking it public again.
In 2018, Musk negotiated with the SEC to seek permission from a lawyer to post tweets about Tesla company. It is still active without approval. If you were an SEC chairperson, how will you handle this issue?
Well, I'm a big believer that former SEC chairmen should be seen and not heard. But notwithstanding that, my response is that I think it's been held now that Musk agreed to this. His efforts to get out from under the agreement have been rejected by the courts, and the courts have allowed private investors to go forward with their lawsuit. This is a serious enough issue, and I think Musk will have to come to some terms in making a settlement with the people who are suing him, because he clearly violated his agreement. He misled investors, and that just can't be allowed to continue.
The issue of non-transparent Chinese companies on the U.S. stock market continues to persist. Concern has been raised that Chinese companies will be forcibly delisted. How likely is it?
I believe that delisting is likely unless there is an agreement between the Chinese government and the US government. The current proposal between the SEC and the Chinese securities regulators is a good first step. But I think this is above the pay grade of regulators. It is absolutely crucial for the government of China to stand behind the commitment that Chinese companies will, in fact, allow US auditors to review their work product. Until that happens, I believe there is a very good likelihood that Chinese companies may be compelled to delist.
Although Wall Street is a move to reduce the scale of investment in Chinese companies, Korean investors are aggressively engaged and investing in Chinese technology companies via ETFs. Do you have any advice? Should we continue to invest?
As I indicated, I believe that until there is a government to government agreement, um, uh, this is far too risky a proposition, and I would not recommend investing until there is a definitive agreement in place that the Chinese government itself subscribes to.
Recently, the SPAC share price plummeted at an increasing loss. SEC also suggests protection measure for investor. And SPAC craze is blowing up in Korea. Are there any precautions to be taken while investing?
The SEC has raised questions which I believe are valid about whether investors are being misled by SPACs. And so in the US, we have seen a decline in the number of SPACs. I believe in Korea, there have been 17 recent SPAC offerings. So the process is still alive and doing well in Korea. But the difficulty is that many people became greedy and they started making estimates that had no basis in reality or in fact. And that led many investors to believe that this was a major positive way to make money, when in fact, many of these SPACs were not able to realize their predictions. I think that all investors have to look at SPACs very, very closely and carefully and make sure that they're getting the correct information. I think there's a purpose to be served by SPACs, but I think the people who are offering them have to do a better job of making fair and full disclosure and allowing investors to see all of the potential risks.
The SEC has reinforced its regulations, such as requiring short-selling investors to reveal monthly position. In Korea, the vision of investor on short selling is negative, so short selling is not as active. However, MSCI requires the Korean stock market to resume short selling. What is your position on the issue of allowing short selling?
Short selling has a very positive impact if it's done correctly. The problem has been in the US, there has been something called naked short selling, which is not as interesting as the name sounds. Naked short selling involves people selling short, but not having located the stock so that they can deliver it when the contract comes due. That's a violation of law. That creates all sorts of problems, but I believe that short selling can be useful as long as it's done lawfully and as long as it's done legitimately. The SEC's new proposals don't require the same kinds of disclosures that are required when people buy shares long. And I think that is something the SEC will need to consider doing. But I do believe there is a place for short selling if it's done legally.
The most active country in the introduction of CBDC among the world is China. In the case of the United States, should they be very careful with this introduction? Have they been? What is your philosophy on CBDC?
I think that this is a very new development. It's one that requires, in the US, the Treasury Department to come up with overarching requirements. This is not something that the SEC alone should be resolving. But I think that if there are standards that are established, this could have a major impact and could be valuable, but there would have to be a common set of rules and laws across nations, and we're far away from that right now.
Perhaps the biggest question for cryptocurrency investors is whether the SEC will approve a Bitcoin spot ETF. Why does the SEC not approve the Bitcoin ETF? In the market, the expectation is that Bitcoin will continue to grow this year. Do you have any predictions as to the Bitcoin ETF approval? Do you think it should be?
I think that there are concerns about the way Bitcoin is marketed and mined, and how secure Bitcoin can be. But it seems to me that we are reaching a point where the SEC will be compelled to approve a Bitcoin EFT, and I believe that it will likely do so in the next few months.
In the NFT market, the number of cases where the price soars or plummets is increasing. The SEC also announced the introduction of NFT regulation. There is also talk that the NFT bubble may burst. How do you rate this market stability?
Right now, I am dubious about the market's stability. I think that there are activities going on. There are not uniform standards being applied, and there are not the protections that people who invest in NFTs need. Again, this is something that will require a set of overarching rules to make certain that those who invest know what they're getting, get what they think they have purchased, and are not subject to the risks that currently the market's instability has created.
In any country, outdated regulations are bound to exist. As a former SEC chairperson, are there any regulations that are outdated and need improvement?
There are. The SEC has, as most regulatory agencies in the US, has a problem in that it adopts rules and then it never goes back and looks at them. It never checks to see how the rules are actually functioning, whether there's a need for improvement or change. One of the things that I wanted to do when I was SEC chairman was engage in a complete review of all SEC rules. Unfortunately, it was there were so many other issues that we had to deal with that we couldn't devote the time and energy and resources to doing that. But I think it is a critical need for the SEC to make certain that its rules are functioning the way they were intended and are still achieving their intended purposes.
If you do not mind, are you investing personally? What would be your portfolio advice for a Korean investor who will watch this?
I do invest. At my age, my time horizons cause me to invest in more stable securities, but I think it depends on the age of investors. If I were a young Korean investor, I would try to find what we used to call blue chip companies, companies that are very well established, and buy the stock and then not trade it. Hold on to it. Over time, that stock, if the company has good fundamentals, will increase. I think for older investors, they should be looking more at certain fixed income assets, bonds and the like, certain government securities that have the full faith and credit of the government entities. But I think investing is very, very important for those who have only a little bit of money to invest. Mutual funds are a very good way of making an investment, and I would recommend those to Korean investors.
I think we cover a lot. Thanks once again for sharing your insight with us.
It's my pleasure.
최근 미국 증시가 긴축 우려로 변동성이 짙어지면서 개인 투자자들도 함께 움츠러들고 있는데요. 증시 하락기에 새로운 투자 대안으로 떠오른 스펙, NFT, 가상자산은 물론 증시에 영향을 미치는 변수로 꼽히는 증권거래위원회, SEC의 주요 현안들까지 살펴봤습니다. 지금까지 하비피트 미국 증권거래위원회 위원장과 함께했습니다. 시청해주신 여러분 고맙습니다.